The cafe doors locked from the inside. A man stepped forward and said loudly, "No one leaves until this is settled." At first, West people thought it was a joke. Then they saw the patch on his chest, Delta Force, and the 4 military SUVs parked outside. The woman in the wheelchair hadn't said a word. She didn't need to, because this moment wasn't just about how the bullies would be dealt with. It was about honor. It was about respect, and about the silence that too many soldiers come home to. And on that day, that silence finally ended. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. It was a quiet Thursday morning in Redford, Colorado. The sun hadn't fully cleared the mountains yet, and the main street still held a touch of mist from the night before. But inside the Maple and Pine Café, the coffee was already flowing, and the breakfast crowd had started to settle in. Grace Hartley rolled through the front door with the same quiet precision she did every morning. The wheels of her custom wheelchair hummed softly over the wooden floor as she made her way to the window seat, her usual table. She wore a faded gray hoodie with a mountain lion insignia printed across the back. Most people wouldn't have recognized it. She had stopped trying to explain what it meant years ago. Grace had served with the 173rd Airborne during her second deployment to Afghanistan, Helmand Province, 2010. An IED had taken both her legs and nearly her life, but she didn't like to talk about that, not to strangers, not to neighbors, not even to the veterans she sometimes nodded to in the grocery store. Today, like most days, she just wanted her coffee. At a center table sat 3 young men in their mid-20s, decked out in high-end athleisure and designer sneakers. They weren't locals. Their voices were loud, careless, and full of the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. One of them, tall, with a camera phone clipped to a small tripod, grinned and nudged his friend. "Yo," he whispered, just loud enough to carry. "She's wearing that army stuff to get the discount. Watch this." His buddy leaned closer, smirking, probably rolling the wheelchair for sympathy. "Bet you it's all an act." The third guy laughed, already checking the angle on his phone. The red recording light blinked steadily. This was their thing, social experiments. They called them viral shorts, pushing norms. Mostly, it meant harassing strangers and editing the clips for maximum clicks. Grace heard it all. She just kept her hands steady on the rim of her wheels and didn't look their way. Years of discipline taught her how to ignore noise. But that didn't mean it didn't sting. The cafe had changed in the past year. Used to be, the old owner kept a display near the register photos of locals who had served, a jar collecting spare change for the VA hospital downstate. But ever since the place was sold and rebranded with trendy chalkboard menus and pumpkin foam lattes, that wall had come down. So had the silence. Grace parked at her table and opened the menu she already knew by heart. She didn't look up. Behind the counter, the young barista glanced in her direction, then quickly looked away, pretending to wipe down a spotless espresso machine. A retired couple sitting nearby stared down at their plates. No one said anything. That was becoming the new norm here, discomfort, followed by silence. One of the men stood and walked past Grace's table, tray in hand. As he passed, he deliberately turned his wrist and let a few drops of hot coffee slosh toward her sleeve. "Oops," he said with mock innocence. "Sorry about that, soldier." His tone dripped with sarcasm. Grace flinched slightly, then calmly pulled a napkin from the holder and dabbed at the armrest of her chair. The liquid hadn't burned, but the moment had landed. Hard. Behind her hoodie, tucked in a zippered chest pocket, was half of a coin medallion, one that used to be whole. The other half had been buried in Helmand, sealed in the hands of the soldier she couldn't save. His name had been Ryan Cooper. He was 25. She could still hear his voice, hoarse and fading, as she dragged him across the dirt while gunfire screamed overhead. "You get out of this, Sarge. Make it worth something." She had. Mostly, some days. She wasn't so sure. Back in the cafe, the 3 men laughed. The tallest of them, the one with the tripod, adjusted the camera and whispered, "This one's gold. Can't wait to post this." The barista stepped into the back, pretending to restock napkins. A customer got up and left without making eye contact. Grace sat still, not because she was okay, but because she was tired. Tired of the whispers, tired of the assumptions, tired of being expected to endure it all with Grace, just because she could. Her fingers moved slowly, reaching into the inside pocket of her hoodie. There, behind the medallion, was a small rubber button no bigger than a bottle cap. A gift from a friend, former Delta Force, the kind of man who spoke little but meant every word. He'd given her that button 3 years ago, placing it in her palm at a reunion she almost didn't attend. "Only press it," he told her. "When silence stops being strength." Grace hadn't thought she'd ever use it. But today, the silence wasn't strength. It was abandonment, from a place that once promised respect. She pressed the button. There was no beep, no signal, no bright lights. But within 30 seconds, something shifted outside. A black SUV rolled slowly down Main Street, pulling up directly in front of the cafe, then another behind it, then two more. All unmarked, but unmistakable to anyone who'd served. The formation, the matte desert tan paint, the engine idle, low and patient. Inside the cafe, no one noticed yet. The three men were still laughing. One had started a fresh recording on his phone, angling toward Grace from over his coffee cup. The man in the corner booth, hooded, silent, unnoticed, folded his newspaper and slid his headphones off. He had been sitting there since the doors opened. He hadn't touched his breakfast, hadn't even ordered a refill, but his eyes had never left Grace. And now, slowly, he stood up. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, then reached up and unzipped his jacket just enough for a small black and silver patch to be visible on his chest. A mountain lion crest, Delta Force. The clock on the cafe wall ticked once. The moment hung. The man smiled faintly. Outside, the fourth SUV engine cut, and inside, the cafe doors clicked locked from the outside. The doors locked with a quiet click, not a slam, not a bang, just a soft, mechanical sound that felt louder than it was because suddenly, the room had gone very still. The three young men looked up in confusion. One of them reached for the handle, but it didn't budge. His smirk flickered. Outside, the four tan SUVs sat idling in a neat row. Military grade, clean, not rental cars, not casual, and certainly not local. One by one, the engines went silent. Inside, the man in the hoodie took a step forward. His boots echoed faintly on the wooden floor. He unzipped his jacket the rest of the way, revealing a dark shirt beneath on it, a subtle but unmistakable patch. Delta Force. Someone near the counter let out a sharp breath. The man raised his voice just enough to carry. "No one leaves," he said calmly. "Not until this is settled." The air shifted. A quiet edge settled across the cafe. Not fear, but discipline. The kind of stillness that only comes when people who've trained together start moving as one. From the back hallway, the door to the kitchen creaked open. Another man entered, his uniform crisp, boots polished, expression unreadable. He carried no weapon. He didn't need one. "Command Directive Protocol, Stand 2 is now in effect," he announced. "All present, remain seated. We are responding to a public breach of military honor." Grace didn't move. She simply turned her head toward the voice and nodded once. Eyes steady. The barista froze, half crouched behind the espresso machine. A server near the window dropped her tray of clean mugs. Ceramic shattered across tile. The three young men at the center table sat very still now. The tallest one with the phone tried to slip it into his jacket, but it was too late. Two more soldiers entered through the rear, then another through the front, each moving with practiced ease. Their posture was upright, eyes forward. They didn't speak to one another. They didn't need to. Each one approached Grace in turn, pausing at her table, one hand to the brow, palms sharp and flat, a formal salute. "Staff Sergeant Hartley," one said firmly, "with respect." Then the next, "Staff Sergeant Hartley, ma'am." Then another, and another, a steady stream of soldiers, men and women, in uniform and out entering the cafe, forming a quiet perimeter. The manager peeked out from the back office, eyes wide. He opened his mouth, but said nothing. Near the drink cooler, a younger employee no older than 20 watched it all unfold. His hands trembled slightly as he held a stack of receipts. He had heard the joke earlier. He hadn't laughed, but he hadn't said anything either. Now, he stepped forward. Without a word, he squared his shoulders and stood at attention. Then he raised his hand and gave a salute, a little stiff, a little unsure, but honest. Grace glanced at him, and for the first time that morning, her face softened. The room was so quiet now. Even the hum of the refrigeration unit felt loud. The tension had turned from confusion to recognition. Everyone knew what this was. The soldiers took their places along the cafe walls. No aggression, just presence. One of them gently moved a decorative plant to clear a walkway. Another picked up a dropped napkin from the floor. Discipline didn't need to announce itself. It just was. The man in the hoodie, now revealed to be a commander of some sort, stepped toward the three young men. His voice was calm, measured. "You targeted a veteran, publicly. You mocked a wounded soldier for sport and attention," he said, "in front of civilians, in front of cameras." One of the men opened his mouth, fumbling. "It was just a joke." The commander's head tilted slightly. "We don't joke about sacrifice." There was no anger in his tone, just gravity, like a stone dropped in water. The man who had spilled coffee shifted in his seat. His foot tapped nervously under the table. From outside, and more figures approached, two older men in full-dress uniform, one with silver stripes along his shoulder. The other, younger, held something carefully in both hands. The younger officer approached Grace and gently placed a folded American flag on the table in front of her. His hands were steady. His eyes didn't leave hers. "This is from your commanding officer," he said. "He asked us to tell you they may forget the war, but we never forget those who came home." For a moment, nothing moved. Then Grace reached out her hand, trembling ever so slightly, and rested her fingers on the fabric. A flicker crossed her face. Not pain, not pride. Something deeper. Something sacred. In the far corner of the cafe, the camera on the tripod was still rolling, still blinking red. No one touched it. The tension in the air now shifted again from silence to reverence. People in the cafe began to rise to their feet, slowly, instinctively. Not out of fear, out of something else. Something they didn't have words for yet. One man took off his hat. A woman near the window wiped her eyes with a napkin. The tallest of the three young men looked as if he wanted to disappear into the floor. His voice cracked. I didn't know." The commander didn't move. "You didn't ask." Across the room, the younger employee who had saluted earlier stepped behind the counter. With quiet determination, he shut off the cafe's music. There was no need for background noise now. The moment spoke for itself. Grace didn't stand, of course, but her posture changed just slightly. Her back straighter, her chin lifted. She looked the men square in the eye. "I don't want your apology," she said quietly. "I just want you to understand. Not all wounds are visible, and not all heroes look like you expect." No one responded. There was nothing to say. Outside, townspeople had started to gather, watching through the windows. Some filming, most just staring. A woman in a postal uniform stood at the curb, hand raised to her heart. A group of teens on bikes had stopped mid-ride, unsure what they were seeing. Inside, the cafe manager stepped forward at last. What is this?" he stammered. "I can't have a scene in my place. This is bad for business." The commander turned slowly. "Sir," he said flatly, "your business was just visited by a woman who crawled 60 meters through gunfire. dragging a wounded soldier with both her legs shredded. He let that settle. She was awarded the Silver Star. She doesn't wear it. She says others deserved it more. The manager's protest died in his throat. No one else spoke. The soldiers remained in place. The cafe was still, and Grace Hartley, for the first time in a very long time, did not feel alone. The folded American flag sat in front of Grace like a sacred offering. The young officer who had placed it there stood at attention, his gaze unwavering, his voice softened, but the words still carried through the room. "From your commanding officer," he said. "He asked us to tell you they may forget the war, but we never forget those who came home." Grace lowered her eyes to the flag. Her fingers brushed over the precise folds, the stitched stars. She didn't speak right away. A figure moved through the formation near the cafe entrance. He wore no uniform, just a simple button-down shirt and a pair of worn jeans. His walk was slow, deliberate. He removed his baseball cap as he approached her table. Grace looked up. The man stopped just short of her. "My name is Thomas Cooper," he said quietly. "My son was Lieutenant Ryan Cooper." There was a hush that followed, deeper than the silence that had come before. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photo. A small 4x6 glossy, the edges slightly bent. He placed it gently beside the flag. In the picture, Ryan Cooper stood on a grassy lawn, arms wrapped around two little boys with wide grins and sun in their hair. A woman, his wife, stood beside them, laughing. Thomas's voice trembled. "If it weren't for you," he said, "those boys would have grown up without their father, and I would never have known what it feels like to be called Grandpa." Grace blinked. Once, twice. Then she whispered, "Ryan told me once. I'm going to try to live long enough so you don't feel like it was all for nothing." Her voice caught at the end. Thomas nodded, eyes misting. "He did, ma'am. He lived. He served again. He's teaching now. He tells your story to every new recruit. No one moved. No one breathed too loud. Even the three young men still seated at their table had gone pale. The tallest one suddenly stood, shoving his chair back in a scraping panic. "I didn't know," he mumbled, edging toward the door. "This is crazy. I didn't mean anything." A soldier at the exit moved smoothly into his path. "Sir," he said, calm but firm, "please return to your seat." The young man looked around, like a trapped animal, but there was no hostility in the room, just eyes watching, waiting. He sat back down. The cafe manager, who had been lingering behind the counter with his phone out, finally stepped forward. "I understand this is emotional," he began, his voice rising slightly, "but this is still a business. I've got customers to think about. I can't have a whole unit show up and shut down my cafe without notice." He turned to the commander, the man in the hoodie, now fully revealed in his bearing and his voice. "I need to ask you to take this outside. You've made your point." The commander didn't even blink. He stepped forward, gaze steady. "Sir," he said, with deliberate calm, "your business was just honored by the presence of a woman who crawled 60 meters through open gunfire, with both legs shredded, to save a bleeding comrade." His words landed like weights dropped on the floor. "She dragged Lieutenant Cooper behind a half-collapsed wall while enemy fire rained down on them. Then she covered his body with hers until the medevac came." The manager opened his mouth, but the commander kept going. "She was awarded the Silver Star for valor. Do you know what that means?" He didn't wait for an answer. "She never wears it." The commander continued, voice quieter now, "because she says there were others more deserving. But make no mistake, that woman over there is why families still have sons." The silence returned. This time, it was reverent. The barista behind the counter had tears in her eyes. The younger employee, still standing at attention, slowly removed his apron and folded it across his arms like a flag. Thomas Cooper stepped forward again. He placed his hand gently on Grace's shoulder. "I waited years to say thank you in person," he said, "and to show you this." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside, nestled in navy velvet, was a second medallion identical to the one Grace kept in her hoodie. This was found in Ryan's vest when they brought him in. He always kept your half with him. Grace's breath caught. For a long moment, she just stared at it. Then slowly, with both hands, she opened the pocket of her hoodie and took out her piece. The two halves fit perfectly. No one spoke. There was no need. The commander stepped back and addressed the room. For those of you recording this, for your view, for your channels, he said, eyeing the blinking tripod camera. I hope your audience understands now what valor really looks like. Then he turned to the soldiers. Reset perimeter. Stand down in 3. They nodded in unison, silent and precise. Grace looked across the room at the 3 young men who had started it all. Their faces were flushed. They wouldn't meet her eyes. The one with the phone slowly reached out and turned off the camera. She didn't yell. She didn't shame them. She simply said, honor isn't a word you get to use until you know what it costs. That was all. No lecture, no punishment, just truth. 1 week later, something new appeared on the back wall of Maple and Pine Café. It wasn't a decoration. It wasn't trendy. It wasn't even mentioned on the cafe's social media, but it was there, bold and permanent. A mural, nearly 6 feet wide, painted with quiet reverence. It showed a woman seated in a wheelchair, her back to the viewer, looking out toward a distant mountain range. Her posture was upright, steady, unshaken, and on the backrest of her chair, painted in deep navy blue, were the words I served, I survived, I stand. Customers paused in front of it each morning now. Some stood with hands in their pockets, just staring. Others quietly bowed their heads. A few even saluted. Below the mural, a small brass plaque had been mounted on a new table near the front window. The same table Grace had always chosen. It read, reserved for those who served. That seat was never empty again. Some mornings, Grace still arrived before the rush, wheeling herself through the front door with the same quiet strength as before. But now, people looked up. Now, people noticed. A young man would rise from his chair and hold the door. A mother would whisper to her son, "That's her." And Grace, she would nod, smile softly, and take her seat. The new manager, a retired Navy corpsman named Bill Hawkins, had made a few changes of his own. Gone were the chalkboard slogans and frothy gimmicks. In their place, a new motto was painted in clear, block letters behind the counter. Respect isn't optional, it's policy. 2 new staff members joined the team that week. Both veterans. One had served in Iraq, the other in Korea. They worked the register and the espresso machine like they'd done it their whole lives. But more than that, they brought something back to the cafe. Something it had lost. A sense of belonging. People started coming not just for the coffee, but for the quiet strength they found there. For the reminder that courage doesn't always look like a uniform or a parade. Sometimes it looks like a woman in a hoodie, rolling quietly into a booth, holding half a medallion in her coat pocket. The town of Redford changed that week. Not overnight, not with headlines or speeches, but with whispers, with gestures, with the soft weight of memory finding its place in the present. One morning, the man in the black hoodie returned. He didn't say a word. He ordered a plain black coffee, nodded to Grace from across the room, and sat in the corner booth again, just like before. But this time, he didn't watch out of caution. He watched with pride. A teenager approached Grace's table one day, fumbling with a notebook in hand. "My teacher told us to write about someone brave," he said. "Can I ask you some questions?" Grace smiled and nodded. "You already just did. Not everyone who came knew the full story, but they felt something when they stepped through those doors. And every so often, someone new would stand by Grace's table, straight-backed and respectful. Sometimes they'd say thank you. Other times, just a quiet I didn't understand before. Now I do." Grace never sought the spotlight. She didn't crave recognition, but something had shifted. She had pressed a button that day not out of pride, but out of necessity. and it had brought her a kind of peace she hadn't known she still needed. The rubber button still lay in the small inner pocket of her hoodie. She checked it once, the week after. It still worked, but she never pressed it again. Not in Redford, because something had changed not just in a building, but in the people who filled it. One evening, after the cafe closed, Bill Hawkins took a picture of the mural. He posted it to the town's online board with a simple caption, "In this town, we remember who made quiet possible." The post didn't go viral, but it didn't need to. The three young men never returned. No one had to ask them to stay away. They knew. But someone did drop off the camera tripod they'd left behind. It was set neatly outside the door with a note taped to it. Sometimes you don't need to film everything to remember it forever. On Veterans Day, a small ceremony was held at Maple and Pine. No big speeches, no cameras, just coffee, folded flags, and the sound of old friends recognizing one another across decades. Grace sat at her table as the sunlight hit the mural behind her. And for the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for the room to go quiet, because it already was. Not from fear, not from pity, but from respect. A little boy walked by her chair that morning and tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Is she a superhero?" he whispered. His mom smiled. "She's something even rarer," she said. "She's a hero who never asked to be seen." Grace overheard. She didn't say anything. She just took a sip of her coffee, let the warmth settle, and looked out the window toward the mountains. And in that quiet space surrounded by people who finally understood, she felt whole.